This is the midnight. Let no star delude us. Dawn is very far. This is the tempest long foretold, slow to make head, but sure to hold. There's a curious convention in this country where winning an election doesn't just mean winning it in the sense of getting the most votes, it means beating expectations. It means outperforming the last opinion poll. And of course, by that standard, the Conservative Party didn't have such a bad night. We played a blinder on the expectations management. I've got to give the party strategists that. In fact, I watched the results coming in with a number of party donors, one or two of whom are in the room now, and I can honestly tell you that when the exit poll flashed up, the preponderant mood was relief. Just stop and think about that for a second. We lost half our vote, we lost 2/3 of our MPs, and the immediate reaction was it could have been worse. My friends, this was a self-inflicted defeat. Every commentator has rushed to point out that the Labour Party is not benefiting from any great surge of enthusiasm, and of course that's true. I can't think of any winning party that has secured office with a lower share of the vote. But from our point of view, doesn't that make things even worse? Up against no opposition, we somehow still managed repeatedly to put the ball in our own net. I'm not going to push that parallel too far in advance of tomorrow's game. Now, there are mitigating factors. Of course there are. There always are. The first, to make an obvious point, is no party in modern times has ever won a 5th term. It's a hell of an ask to be re-elected 5 times in a row. I don't know how many of you spent the month before the election knocking on doors, as I did, but if you did, you'll have been struck by the sheer range of objections, some of them more sensible than others, that people had to the government. So among the reasons that I heard from ex-Tory voters for not voting Conservative this time was the badger cull, the post office scandal, and the fact that we're sending money to Zelensky. My point being, after 14 years in office, you are bound to accumulate a number of grievances, and people will attribute every irritation and imperfection to such a long-standing government. So I get that. By the way, does anyone know when, I'm excluding Dr. Starkey or other professional historians, the last time that a party won a 5th consecutive general election? Clue, you have to go back to before the Reform Act. I think it last happened when the Duke of Wellington was our party leader, a rather better Duke than the current Duke politically. When the Duke of Wellington was our party leader, and even then, that was the 1830 election, we were so pulverized 2 years later at the 1832 election that the response was to close the party down and relaunch it under Robert Peel as the newfangled Conservative Party, Tory men and Whig measures, as Disraeli put it. There was an even bigger mitigating factor, although it was curiously unmentioned throughout the campaign, which is our selective national amnesia about the lockdowns. Every government on the planet, pretty much, that was in office when the bills came in, suffered electorally. There were 1 or 2 which were sly enough to pick the moment during the pandemic crisis and increase their majorities, because at that time, when they were dominating the airwaves, when they were giving their statesman-like bulletins on the health crisis, they were almost unbeatable. So Justin Trudeau in Canada and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand picked that moment. But it's a different thing when the bills come in. And actually, much of what I heard on doorsteps, and all of you will recognize this if you've been doing any canvassing, was really a complaint about the effects of a lockdown, which the country as a whole not only demanded, but wanted to go further. So people say, why are our taxes going up? Well, why do you think we paid people at home to stay home for 2 years? I mean, what was going to happen? Why have prices gone up? Well, we covered the difference by printing money. Why are NHS waiting lists so high? Well, duh, why do you think, right? I mean, but people do not like to be reminded of this. And therefore, every incumbent government has been in this difficult position. There was a moment in the very first leaders' debate when somebody in the audience raised the issue of NHS waiting lists. Rishi Sunak perfectly validly said, hang on, we've been through this pandemic, but waiting times are much longer in Labour-run Wales than in Conservative-run England, and the audience groaned. Because if you have crammed memory of the lockdown into the remotest corner of your mind, then any politician mentioning the subject comes across as whinging. So I say all this by way of accepting that there were mitigating factors. People don't want, mathematically, the laws of maths tell me that a lot of the people moaning about the impact of the lockdown must have been in the 71% who wanted to retain it when Boris lifted restrictions in the summer of 2021, let alone the 93% who backed it in the first place. But none of that excuses our unforced errors. None of that explains a defeat on this scale, the single worst result we have ever suffered as a party since that great and underrated man, Sir Robert Peel, established us with the Tamworth Manifesto. We made unforced errors of process and of policy. It was, I think, catastrophic to change two leaders without a general election, almost regardless of the qualities of the people involved. That is always going to come across to the electorate as a cabal of people handing down their choice and saying, you little voters, you will put up with whatever we give you. And we did it twice in 3 months. And our opinion poll standing never recovered. And of course, we made promises that we then didn't keep, above all on immigration. Yes, mitigating factors, there always are. We were in the EU at first, and then we had special schemes for Ukrainians and Hong Kongers and Afghans. But nonetheless, we repeatedly made promises and didn't keep them. Now, where does that leave us? I agree with what Dr. Starkey just said. This government will become unpopular because this immense majority is based on no commensurate sense of public enthusiasm. When Tony Blair came in 97, he brought, in the wake of that huge majority, if you like, a margin of benefit of the doubt. People were prepared to say, look, you've been left a tough situation and we'll trust you. That, if there is anyone arguing that today, they are keeping very quiet. So it may be that this record parliamentary majority, this Burj Khalifa of a majority, is in fact built on sand dunes. And when things turn tough, people will realize that all of the problems that were there under the previous government remain unaddressed. We are still spending massively more than we can afford as a country, fully 3 years after the end of lockdown and with the financial crisis a distant memory. And I see absolutely no sign of this government being prepared to bring spending even remotely close to where it was in February of 2020, prior to the pandemic. So when it's Keir Starmer having to send nurses away empty-handed or cut teachers' pay or whatever, the mood, I think, will change very quickly. The question is, who will be there to exploit it? Will there be an evident government in waiting, serious, responsible, offering a coherent programme, and able to step in with something better? What can we do to put ourselves in that situation? I have a couple of suggestions. The first may seem very dull, but it's important. You have to fix the plumbing. This campaign, just as a political campaign, was plainly lost by our party and plainly won by the other party. Now, in a way, that's kind of inescapable, right? When you've been in office for a long time, your best minds are going to be running Whitehall departments. The greatest talent in any governing party is going to be doing precisely that, governing, whereas all the best minds in Labour were focused on campaigning and winning. That is part of the seesaw of opposition and government in this country. But we do have to sort that out and we have to prioritise it. I can't remember a campaign when people haven't complained about candidate selection. But this time, I really was struck by how many very good people were not allowed to, well, one or two of whom, again, I see in here, were not allowed to fight winnable seats, and some rather more contestable decisions were made in favour of others. We do need to look at those mechanics. I mean, it would have been nice, wouldn't it, if we'd had a few more people in the party machine advising the PM on the election date rather than betting on it. It was an extraordinary unforced error. It's like that internet meme of the person putting a stick in his own bicycle wheel. We somehow managed to call an election which caught ourselves off guard, but not any of the other parties. And until we have fixed, on a very basic level, the machinery of the party, we don't expect to win the next one. Secondly, I think we need to be statesmanlike, right? By which I mean we should resist the temptation to attack everything that Labour does simply because Labour is doing it. Now, heaven knows there are going to be plenty of things that we do need to attack, from the tax rises that are surely coming to the insane decision to give the vote to people whom in every other context the Labour Party considers to be legally children. The Labour Party has enthusiastically said that if you are under 18 but over 16, you're not allowed to buy a knife or get a tattoo or get a mortgage or have Botox treatment or buy a bottle of wine or leave full-time work, but you should be allowed to vote on whether anybody else can do that. There's going to be plenty of stuff for us to oppose. But let's give them our support if we see them doing things that are basically conservative policy. Most obviously, building more stuff. Right? There's a lot of backlog of building decisions that we have tried to get through. If the Labour Party now tries to do them, we should do it. If, for example, they legalise onshore wind, which is one of the first decisions that they've announced, then our response should not be, oh, terrible, you know, you're putting hideous windmills on beautiful upland areas. It should be, yes, good, but why not extend the logic to fracking and other sources of energy? We should be a constructive opposition, and particularly this is true in the areas where Labour can do things that the Conservative Party can't. A point that Jeremy Hunt made in a very gracious and statesmanlike concession speech or victory speech in his constituency. Labour is trusted to do things on the NHS. Now, up until now, I've been very sceptical about whether they would do it. Wes Streeting talks about tough decisions. Taking them is a different matter. But it's just possible. Bringing back Alan Milburn, talking about putting the patient over the producer, it's just possible that we may get a move towards a more continental model of healthcare. And if Labour is doing that, we should support and not nitpick. And so on with benefits or pension reform or whatever it is. The big one, I don't need to repeat it all because we just heard it from David Starkey. A large part of what we got wrong and what created the space for reform was not a sort of unpatriotic, wet Tory party not trying. It was the inability of ministers to get things through hostile bureaucrats, quangocrats, and judges on everything from telling us what energy policy we're allowed to always and everywhere opposing every deportation order from the bench. And until we have fixed that, we're always going to find ourselves back where we are. We're in a very strange position where our media and political climate only wants to blame politicians. If civil servants are breaking lockdown rules, it's only of interest, it's only a story if in some way a minister can be said to be involved. Ministers are therefore blamed for decisions, whether it's repeated overturning of the Rwanda scheme, or whether it's failures of procurement, or whether it's people absconding from prisons, that a moment's thought would reveal that the minister doesn't want to happen, but that the entire machine is there to thwart the minister's will. I've been serving, I expect this won't last much longer, but I've been on the Board of Trade, and the extraordinary inertia there, the institutional resistance to lowering trade barriers, even for products that we don't have in this country. You know, we still, do you remember the great tomato shortage of last year when you couldn't get tomatoes apparently on any supermarket shelf? We were still imposing tariffs and quotas on non-EU tomatoes. We don't grow tomatoes in this country, not really. We have a very short season which doesn't clash by a single day with that of our main source countries, and yet we couldn't get a change as simple as that past our officials. Every time I raised it in Parliament, the minister would say, yes, this must happen. And he would say that so that it would be on the record in Hansard so that his officials would act on it. They never did. Why? Well, We'll all have our own theories, but I suspect in the end, the only explanation that works is that they were trying to hold the door open for some kind of customs deal with the EU under Keir Starmer, and they didn't want to diverge in any way from old existing EU trade policy because they thought that that might make things more difficult. If we can put our own house in order, then the question of relations with other parties of the right assumes a secondary importance. The surge in support for reform was primarily a consequence of Tory failure, as indeed most of my reform friends are loud and keen to tell me. Now, I'm not averse to having any kind of arrangements with anyone who's interested. In fact, in the run-up to the 2015 election, I argued that there should be some kind of pact between the Tories and UKIP, at least in seats where it would make a difference, a little bit like the UUP and the DUP used to do in selected seats in Northern Ireland. Obviously, my advice was not taken. Actually, UKIP in 2015 got a remarkably similar result to the result just secured by reform. Okay, they didn't get any seats, but in terms of their share of the vote, in terms of the number of places where they came second, it was a comparable result. What happened then? Well, in the 2017 and 2019 elections, the vote of UKIP and then the Brexit Party fell away because we had delivered Brexit. And then we had Boris Johnson as party leader in 2019. In other words, we didn't fret primarily about what relationship to have with another party. We concentrated on doing the right thing, and that issue looked after itself. Now, like I say, I'm perfectly open to any amicable conversations, but all of that is secondary. The primary objective, under whatever leader, under whatever direction, must be to make ourselves the alternative vehicle for government. If you go back before 1834, if you count the Tory party as the prelude to our existing Conservative Party, we are by a long way the oldest party in discovered space. We've been around for 3.5 centuries, and we've survived that long because, like Doctor Who, we can endlessly regenerate according to the needs of that moment. There is no reason why we shouldn't regenerate now, provided that, unlike Doctor Who, we don't go woke and forget what made us popular in the first place. And that, it seems to me, is our task, and that is why we are all gathered here today, to remember that oldest of Tory creeds, which is to prefer the organic and the evolved and the familiar to the planned and the imposed and the centralized, to speak, as Disraeli put it, for the sublime instincts of an ancient people.